few months ago, I decided enough is enough. I'm finally going to read two of the most important works in Western civilization, the Odyssey and the Iliad by Homer. Now that I've read them both, I'm going to sit down and give you the full-length reviews for each. We're going to start with the Iliad. Now, I will say, I've read Homer before all this. About 6 years ago, I read a fairly dated prose translation of the Odyssey, which is a much more accessible and good entry point into Greek literature. And since then, I had read all other kinds of Greek literature, philosophy, history, plays, things like that. So I was feeling like I was somewhat versed enough that I could go into the Iliad. I had a pretty interesting time with it, even though I will say the Iliad was much more difficult than the Odyssey, okay? The Iliad was a lot more stoic and difficult. It had a lot of sections that were very slog heavy. But yeah, let's get into detail about Homer's The Iliad. Ancient Greek writers wrote stories in a way where they expected their audience to already understand the myths that they were pulling from. So I did something for this which I never normally do when I'm reading, which is I read the introduction to this book, and I went online and I watched a bunch of videos explaining the story around the Trojan War and how it started and the major players and all of this contextualization. And boy am I glad I did that, because the story, you get thrown straight into it. There's no context, there's no setup, just bam! We're in front of the gates of Troy, the war's been going on for 9 years, we're not going to talk about how it started, we're not going to show how it ends, there's no Achilles heel, there's no Trojan horse. It's best to think of the Iliad like a self-contained story that's set within the Trojan War, as opposed to telling the story of the Trojan War itself. In this case, the Iliad focuses on the petty grievances of a warrior named Achilles, who sits on a beach and mopes for most of the story. So we see how Achilles' inaction and his ego or whatever leads the Greeks to standing a lot more outnumbered than they otherwise would have been. So that's what most of the story is. Right when I started the Iliad, I could feel myself getting excited as I re-entered Homer's world after so many years away from it. I was reminded of this high scale of adventure, the epic mythology of gods and goddesses on both sides. Unfortunately, it wasn't very long before it became very apparent that I was not going to enjoy the Iliad as much as I did the Odyssey. The beginning and the ending of the Iliad are both great. It's all the stuff that I enjoy out of Homer, and then you're thrown into the battle. And the battle is ironically where the pacing of this book grinds to a halt, and it kind of stays in this holding pattern the whole time. And why is that, you may ask? Well, it's because of the way that the battle is written. You know those sections of the Bible that are like so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so over and over and over? That's what the Iliad feels like, except instead of begetting new life, it's about taking out life. It's so-and-so killed so-and-so killed so-and-so. You get these short little stories about each person. You're like, oh, and he came from over here, and this is how he grew up, and then he got a spear through the eye, and then it's just that over and over and over again. It's gory, and it's grisly, and it's brutal, but even the most horrific violence can get boring if it's done too much. And oh my god, Homer goes right past that point really early on, and then he just keeps going and going and going, and you're like, okay, do you want to give us some variety here? And then he says, why yes, sure, I'll throw in some side quests here. And oh, thank God, every time it happens, it's like a big relief, because it's something to focus on other than like the white noise of bloodshed here. You pull away to Mount Olympus and the drama between the gods, or every once in a while there'll be like this little scheme to turn the tides of the war, where like some characters will sneak off at night to try and learn the plans of their opponents, or they'll do a sacrifice to Athena or something like that. But in spite of those few moments of reprieve, I found that most of the Iliad just kind of stayed stuck. Every time you thought that the status quo was changing or the story was starting to go somewhere new, it would just circuitously go all the way back to right where you started. So after a while of that happening, I was starting to feel a little bit disheartened as I was going forward with it. I also remembered, of course, all of the little things about ancient writing that I find a little bit difficult. For example, it seems every other ancient epic poem that I read has overly long, indulgent descriptions, especially of armies, and the Iliad is no exception to that, because the section describing the armies at Troy goes on for 12 pages, just listing every single army that was there. There's a lot of repetition in a way that's sort of similar to the chorus of a song, because after all, Homer was recited out loud to an audience most of the time. There's a part where a god wants to put a dream inside someone's head to convince them to do something, and we get that dream told to us verbatim 3 times. So it's a little bit tricky to navigate some of that. It was certainly intimidating, but I was willing to keep going. I found that the most interesting aspect of the Iliad's middle chunk was all the stuff having to do with the gods. In both the Iliad and the Odyssey, you get these cutaway scenes where it's just like, I wonder what the gods are up to now! In the Iliad, it happens a lot more often, and it's a good thing too, because it was a relief every time we got to cut away from the repetitive war story. The gods are a lot of fun in this. We learn about their different motivations for taking one side against the other in the conflict down below, and how their interference leads to events playing out how they do. The gods turn out to be the source of pretty much all of the momentum in this story, as even the smallest of actions and decisions down below are ascribed to one god or another, interfering or tipping the scales of fate. Characters in these ancient stories tended to be on the simple side. My favorite among the mortals was Diomedes and Odysseus. Achilles was a character that I absolutely loved to hate. I can't remember the last time I've despised a character this much in fiction. There are these scenes where they go to him begging, like, we'll do whatever you want, we'll even give you your slave girl back, just please help us in this fight. And he's just like, I don't think I will. So yeah, I wanted to throttle him the entire time. And then of course we've got the gods and goddesses. Among all of the characters in the book, my favorite was the goddess Athena and her BFF Hera. Both of these goddesses want to see Troy absolutely destroyed because they lost a beauty contest to Aphrodite and Paris. So you might be tempted to be like, wow, that's a pretty sexist trope, but don't worry, this book is about equal opportunity assholism. The men are just as petty as the women in this story. People who are familiar with the Iliad in passing, who haven't read it, will probably be aware that there's a major story beat in the Iliad that's very famous, where it really changes the complexion of the war. When it finally does happen, you can really feel that shift in tone. Despite the battle continuing in a similar way that it was before, the intensity is amped up. There's this feeling of destiny and inevitability that's been mounting and mounting, and suddenly the fighting is a lot more desperate and personal. The emotions are brought to the surface. Zeus decides to unleash all the gods who he'd been kind of holding back before, so it becomes like this no-holds-barred fight to the death that is absolutely epic, and there's a lot of humor that comes up as a result of this. The gods are like exchanging insults with one another like they're on the Jersey Shore. It's really interesting, entertaining stuff. I just felt myself wishing that this tone and this level of intensity and storytelling had been achieved throughout the book. One thing that I also found interesting was how the Iliad avoids this sense of romanticizing war, or talking about like the manly virtues of battle and all this stuff. It avoids all of that and instead goes for this angle of like the tragedy of war and look at what we as humans do to each other. Isn't it awful? It was a pretty interesting tone to take because I know how important martial virtues were in the ancient Greek world. I got all of these insights into Greek culture that were a little bit deeper than I would say in the Odyssey because of how much we were cutting to the gods and their influence over every little action. Even things that seem like chance or petty decisions made by the characters are explained away by the gods. So it's like the Greeks will retroactively tell themselves these stories in order to explain why events play out the way that they do. It's very similar to Abrahamic religions, except in those religions there's one God. And so when the outcomes of your life seem in conflict with each other, you can just say, oh, well, God is unknowable, we can never understand his grand picture. But in Greek mythology, there are many gods, and they all have their different motivations, and they're all struggling and vying for the most influence over the mortals. So it led me to wonder, well, why even worship these gods if they're so flawed and terrible and blah blah blah? And it's clear over the course of this book, you don't worship Greek gods because you love them or anything like that. It's because you see over and over again what it means to have a god on your side in a battle, or even worse, to have a god against you in a battle. So worshipping the gods in ancient Greece seems to be a lot more akin to taking out an insurance policy than any sort of reverence or love for a higher power. There were definitely a lot of things to appreciate about the Iliad. The beginning and ending sections were quite enjoyable. The insights I got into Greek mythology were also a pretty great bonus, but I can't overemphasize how much of a slog that middle section was. I read this with two friends, and both of them nearly dropped out. One of them actually did, because it's just a lot to get through. I can't help but feel most people are going to prefer the Odyssey over the Iliad. The Odyssey to me is still the perfect place to start if you've never read Greek literature before. So that's what I would recommend instead of the Iliad. The Iliad is only if you really want that story to really have that classic finished and under your belt. Because I will say, even though I would rate this only like a 5.5 out of 10, that I'm still glad that I read it. I'm glad that I know it, and maybe I'll come back to it far from now and get a lot more out of it, because I do plan on reading and learning more about ancient Greek stuff. But anyway, that's my review. Hope you enjoyed. If you've read the Iliad or any of Homer and you have any insights or opinions to share with me, I would love to hear from you. Hopefully I've inspired you to take up Homer and haven't scared you away too much by how I wasn't completely sold on the Iliad. Like I said, there's a lot of ancient writing out there that's great. I think this is probably the most challenging that I have read in ancient mythology. But yeah, that's me. I've been deep in the reads. I plan on posting my full review of the Odyssey in maybe a week or two, so stay tuned for that. Also, check out my short video updates on reading through Homer if you're so inclined, and I will see you next time.